The busy halls of Memorial Hospital echoed with the usual sounds of a Monday morning as Sarah Washington started her shift. At 32 years old, she had been working as a nurse in the rehabilitation ward for the past 5 years. Her dark skin glowed with natural beauty, and her kind eyes always made patients feel at ease. She wore her hair in neat braids, pulled back in a practical style that suited her no-nonsense approach to work. That morning began like any other. Sarah checked her patient list and noticed a new name: James Cooper, recently transferred from the intensive care unit. The note said he was a 35-year-old software engineer who had been in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. She gathered her supplies and headed to room 415, not knowing this routine visit would change her life forever. As Sarah entered the room, she found James sitting up in his bed, typing away on a laptop. He looked up and gave her a warm smile that made his blue eyes sparkle. Despite being confined to his bed, he had an energy about him that filled the room. His brown hair was slightly messy, and a few days' worth of stubble covered his jaw, but he somehow managed to look professional even in a hospital gown. "Good morning, Mr. Cooper. I'm Sarah, and I'll be your nurse during your stay here," she said, pushing her cart of supplies closer to his bed. "Please call me James," he replied, closing his laptop. "And thank you for coming to check on me, though I must warn you, I'm probably the most stubborn patient you'll ever meet." Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "Trust me, Mr. Cooper, James, I dealt with plenty of stubborn patients before." As she checked his vital signs and reviewed his medication, they started talking. Sarah learned that James hadn't let his accident stop him from working. He had adapted his home office with voice recognition software and continued developing programs for major tech companies. He spoke about his work with such passion that Sarah found herself asking questions about coding, even though she barely understood the answers. "You know," James said, while Sarah changed his IV bag, "most people's eyes glaze over when I start talking about programming. You're either really good at pretending to be interested, or you're actually curious." Sarah smiled as she adjusted the drip rate. "Maybe a bit of both. I've always believed that understanding my patients' lives helps me take better care of them. Plus, you explain things in a way that actually makes sense to non-tech people." Their conversation flowed easily from topic to topic. James told her about growing up in Boston with parents who owned a successful chain of restaurants. Sarah shared stories about her childhood in Atlanta, where her father worked as a high school teacher and her mother ran a small bakery. They discovered they both loved old jazz music and had a shared addiction to solving crossword puzzles. Time flew by, and Sarah realized she had spent much longer in James's room than she usually did with patients. As she was about to leave, James called out, "Hey Sarah, would you mind bringing me a crossword puzzle tomorrow? The hospital TV only shows 3 channels, and I've already watched everything on my laptop twice." "Sure thing," she replied, thinking nothing of it. After all, many patients ask for small favors to make their stay more comfortable. The next day, Sarah brought not just one but several crossword puzzles from her favorite puzzle book. She found James sitting in his wheelchair by the window, looking out at the city skyline. They spent her break time solving one puzzle together, with James surprising her by knowing obscure historical facts that she would never have guessed. This became their daily routine. Sarah would finish her rounds and spend her break time with James, solving puzzles or just talking. Other nurses noticed how James's whole face lit up whenever Sarah entered his room, and how she always seemed to find extra time to check on him. Sarah told herself she was just being a dedicated nurse, but deep down, she knew something was different about James. It wasn't just his disability that set him apart. It was his spirit, his intelligence, and the way he made her laugh even on the hardest days. Without realizing it, she had started looking forward to their daily conversations, and for the first time in her career, she found herself hoping a patient would stay longer in the hospital. 3 months after James left the hospital, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about him. Even though hospital rules said nurses shouldn't stay in contact with former patients, she kept remembering his smile and the way he made her laugh. She was surprised when she saw him waiting outside the hospital one evening after her shift ended. "James," she said, walking over to his wheelchair, "what are you doing here?" He looked handsome in a blue button-down shirt and dark pants, his hair neatly styled. "I know this might seem strange," he said, "but I really missed our crossword puzzles. Would you like to get coffee with me?" Sarah knew she should say no. She could already hear what people would say, not just because James was a former patient, but because he was white and used a wheelchair. But looking at his hopeful face, she found herself saying yes. They went to a small coffee shop nearby. James had already called ahead to make sure it was wheelchair accessible. As they talked, it felt just like their conversations in the hospital, but better because now they could be just Sarah and James, not nurse and patient. That coffee date turned into dinner the next week, and soon they were seeing each other regularly. James showed Sarah the computer programs he was working on, and she was amazed by how he could create entire virtual worlds with just his keyboard. Sarah told him about her dreams of opening a small medical clinic in her old neighborhood someday. But not everyone was happy about their relationship. One day, Sarah's father, David Washington, invited her over for Sunday dinner. As soon as she arrived, she could tell something was wrong. "Baby girl," her father said, sitting her down in the living room, "your mother and I are worried about you. This man you're seeing? Are you sure about this?" Sarah felt her heart sink. "Daddy, James is a wonderful person. His disability doesn't change that." "It's not just about his disability," Sarah, her mother, Rachel, added from the kitchen doorway. "Life is already hard enough for black women in this world. Are you ready for what people will say about you dating a white man and taking care of someone in a wheelchair? That's a big responsibility." "I'm a nurse, Mama. I know about caring for people," Sarah replied. "And James doesn't need someone to take care of him. He needs a partner. He's independent, successful, and he makes me happy." Meanwhile, James was having his own family problems. His parents, Richard and Elizabeth Cooper, lived in a big house in the wealthy part of town. When James told them about Sarah, his mother dropped her teacup, spilling tea all over their expensive carpet. "A nurse?" Elizabeth said, dabbing at the carpet with a napkin. "James, dear, you could date any woman from our social circle. What about Susan Mitchell? Her father owns that big tech company." "Mom, I don't want to date Susan Mitchell," James said firmly. "I love Sarah. She sees me for who I am, not my family's money or my disability." Richard Cooper looked up from his newspaper. "Son, are you sure she's not just interested in your money?" James felt anger rising in his chest. "Sarah didn't even know about our family's wealth until today. She works harder than anyone I know, and she has her own dreams and goals." Over the next few weeks, both Sarah and James stood firm against their family's doubts. They started spending more time together, learning to navigate their different worlds. James showed Sarah how to play chess on his special computer setup, and Sarah taught him her grandmother's secret recipe for sweet potato pie. They'd also face stares and whispers when they went out together. Some people would look away quickly when they saw James's wheelchair. Others would stare openly at the black woman holding hands with a white man. But Sarah and James found strength in each other. One evening, as they watched the sunset from James' apartment balcony, Sarah realized something important. "You know what?" she said, squeezing his hand. "Everyone who doubts us just makes me more sure about us." James smiled and pulled her closer. "I was just thinking the same thing. We're proving them all wrong, one day at a time." And they were. Every obstacle they faced only made their bond stronger. Their different backgrounds, their family's doubts, his disability. None of it mattered when they were together. They were writing their own story, one that didn't fit into anyone else's boxes or expectations. As summer turned to fall, Sarah and James's relationship grew stronger each day. They started seeing a couples therapist, Dr. Martinez, who specialized in helping couples facing unique challenges. During their sessions, they learned to talk openly about their fears and hopes. "Tell me what worries you most," Dr. Martinez asked during one session, looking at Sarah with kind eyes. Sarah took a deep breath. "Sometimes I worry about the future. Not because of James's disability, but because the world can be so cruel. Last week, a woman at the grocery store asked me if I was James's caregiver. It hurt that she couldn't imagine we were a couple." James reached for her hand. "And I worry that I'm not enough for Sarah, that someday she'll want someone who can dance with her or run on the beach." Sarah turned to him with tears in her eyes. "James Cooper, don't you know that I'd rather sit and solve crossword puzzles with you than dance with anyone else?" These therapy sessions helped them grow closer and understand each other better. They started having weekly family dinners, inviting both sets of parents to James' apartment. At first, these dinners were awkward and quiet. Sarah's father would stare at his plate, and James's mother would make polite but distant conversation. But things began to change one Sunday when James's oven broke down right before dinner. Sarah's mother, Rachel, took charge of the situation. "Well, we can't let good food go to waste," she said, helping Sarah pack everything up. "Let's all go to our house." That evening, something shifted. In the warm comfort of the Washington family home, with Rachel's collection of family photos on the walls and the smell of soul food filling the air, the two families started to really talk. Richard Cooper, James's father, discovered he shared a love of jazz with David Washington. Elizabeth Cooper was amazed by Rachel's cooking and begged for her cornbread recipe. James watched from his wheelchair as their families slowly became one. He saw how Sarah moved around the kitchen with her mother and his, all three women laughing as they shared cooking tips. He noticed how their fathers sat in the living room, deep in conversation about their favorite musicians. Later that night, after everyone left, Sarah and James stayed to help clean up. "You know," Sarah's father said as he dried dishes, "I was wrong about you, James. You're a good man. I can see how much you love my daughter." James felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you, sir. I do love her, more than anything." In their daily life, Sarah and James created their own routines. They learned that while some things were harder, others were surprisingly easy. James taught Sarah how to fix his wheelchair when it got stuck, and she showed him shortcuts around the city that were more accessible. They discovered restaurants with good ramps, movie theaters with the best wheelchair spots, and parks with smooth paths. One day, Sarah came home from a long shift at the hospital to find James had cooked dinner using a special kitchen setup he'd designed himself. The counter heights were adjusted, and he'd installed smart controls that let him manage everything from his wheelchair. "You did all this yourself?" Sarah asked, amazed at the delicious smell of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables. James grinned proudly. "Well, I had some help with the installation, but I designed it. I wanted to show you that I can take care of you too." That night, as they ate dinner on his balcony under the stars, Sarah realized something important. All the people who had doubted them were seeing only problems, but she and James saw possibilities. Every challenge they faced made them find creative solutions together. "I love you," Sarah said suddenly, looking at James across the table. "Not to spite anything, just because you're you." James smiled, his eyes shining. "And I love you, Sarah Washington, exactly as you are." They were learning that love wasn't about everything being perfect or easy. It was about choosing each other every day, finding joy in small moments, and building a life that worked for them, no matter what anyone else thought. James had been planning this moment for 3 months. He wanted his proposal to Sarah to be perfect, something that would show her how much thought and love he put into their relationship. As a software engineer, he knew he could use his skills to create something special. For weeks, he worked late into the night after Sarah left his apartment, programming a virtual reality experience that would tell their love story. He contacted Sarah's hospital coworkers, her family, and his own family to collect videos and photos of their journey together. His hands moved quickly over the keyboard as he built a virtual world that would surround Sarah with their memories. On the day he planned to propose, James asked Sarah to come over after her shift for what she thought would be a normal dinner. His heart was beating fast as he heard her key in the door. He had set up everything perfectly, the VR headset was ready, and the ring was hidden in a small box next to his wheelchair. "James?" Sarah called out as she entered. She stopped in surprise. The apartment was filled with soft lighting, and her favorite flowers, yellow daisies, were everywhere. "Welcome home," James said, rolling forward to meet her. "I have something special planned for tonight." Sarah looked curious as James handed her the VR headset. "What's this about?" "Trust me," he said with a smile. "Put it on." As soon as Sarah put on the headset, she gasped. She found herself standing in a virtual version of the hospital hallway where they first met. A hologram of James appeared in his hospital bed, typing on his laptop just like that first day. "This is where our story began," James's voice narrated, "when the most beautiful nurse in the world walked into room 415. The scene changed, showing their first coffee date, then their family dinners, all recreated in beautiful 3D graphics. Sarah turned slowly, taking in the virtual memories surrounding her. She saw moments she remembered and some she didn't know had been captured, like when she fell asleep on James's shoulder during movie night, or when they got caught in the rain at the park. Then the virtual world transformed into a garden filled with twinkling lights. Photos and videos from their time together floated in the air around her. She saw videos from their parents, her coworkers, and her friends, each sharing a special message about their love story. "Sarah," James's voice said in the virtual world, "you walked into my hospital room and brought light back into my life. You never saw my wheelchair as a barrier. You saw me for who I am." Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she watched their memories play out around her. When the screen faded to a message asking her to remove the headset, she found James waiting for her in the real world, holding a small velvet box in his hands. "Sarah Washington," he said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion, "you've shown me that love has no boundaries. You've stood by me through everything, fought for us when others doubted, and brought more joy to my life than I ever thought possible." He opened the box, revealing a beautiful ring with a simple diamond. "Will you marry me?" Sarah stood there, tears running down her cheeks. The whole apartment seemed to hold its breath as she looked at the man she loved, the man who had just created an entire virtual world to show her their love story. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, yes, yes." She knelt down next to his wheelchair and hugged him tight as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, just like they did together. What happened next surprised them both. Sarah took a quick photo of the ring on her hand and posted it on social media with the caption, "He created a virtual reality world to propose, and I said yes, #love has no boundaries." Within hours, their story went viral. People from around the world started sharing their post, amazed by James's creative proposal and touched by their love story. News websites picked up the story, calling it the proposal that proved love knows no limits. But Sarah and James hardly noticed all the attention. That night, they sat together on James's balcony, looking at the stars. Sarah kept glancing at her ring, still amazed by how James had planned everything. "I can't believe you made an entire virtual world for me," she said softly. James smiled and squeezed her hand. "You created a whole new world for me the day you walked into my hospital room. I just wanted to show you what that felt like." After their proposal went viral, Sarah and James received hundreds of messages from people around the world. Many were from other interracial couples or couples where one person had a disability. Their story was giving hope to others, but Sarah and James were focused on planning their perfect wedding. The first challenge was finding the right venue. Every weekend, they visited different places, checking for wheelchair accessibility. Some beautiful halls had stairs everywhere, while others had ramps but tiny bathrooms. Sarah kept detailed notes on her phone about each place they saw. "This is harder than I thought it would be," Sarah sighed one Sunday after visiting their fifth venue. They were sitting in James's car, tired from another disappointing search. "Maybe we're looking in the wrong places," James said thoughtfully. "What about the botanical gardens? Remember how much you loved it when we went there last spring?" Sarah's eyes lit up. The gardens had wide, smooth paths, beautiful flowers, and plenty of space. When they visited the next day, the garden manager, Mrs. Chen, showed them a perfect spot under a large oak tree. There was even a paved path leading right to it. "We can set up the chairs in a circle," Mrs. Chen suggested, "so everyone has a good view, and James can easily move around." While the venue was settled, choosing their wedding traditions was another challenge. Sarah's family had strong African American wedding customs, while James's family expected a traditional white wedding. They decided to blend both cultures in their ceremony. "We'll jump the broom," Sarah explained to James's mother, Elizabeth, during a planning dinner. "It's an African American tradition that symbolizes sweeping away the old and welcoming the new." Elizabeth, who had grown to love Sarah like a daughter, asked thoughtful questions about the tradition. She then shared ideas about incorporating James's family traditions too. They decided to use his grandmother's old lace for Sarah's veil, combining something old with something new. The biggest surprise came when both mothers went shopping with Sarah for her wedding dress. In the bridal shop, Rachel and Elizabeth worked together, helping Sarah try on dresses and giving honest opinions. When Sarah finally found the perfect dress, a beautiful gown that would look stunning next to James's wheelchair, both mothers cried happy tears. James had his own preparations to handle. He ordered a special wheelchair for the wedding, painted white to match their color scheme. He also took secret dance lessons with his physical therapist, hoping to surprise Sarah with a special moment during their reception. Their friends from the hospital planned a unique wedding shower. Instead of traditional gifts, they asked guests to contribute to Sarah's dream of opening a medical clinic. James's tech company colleagues created a website where people could donate to the cause. "You've inspired so many people," Sarah's best friend Lisa told her during the shower. "Look at all these messages from donors." Sarah read through the comments, touched by strangers' kindness. One message read, "Your love story showed me that nothing is impossible. Here's to making more dreams come true." As the wedding day got closer, Sarah and James had one more special plan. They decided to make their wedding accessible for everyone. They hired sign language interpreters and made sure all written materials were available in Braille. Their wedding website included detailed accessibility information. "We want everyone to feel welcome," James explained during a meeting with their wedding planner. "Just like how Sarah and her family welcomed me." One evening, a month before the wedding, Sarah found James working late on his computer again. "Another secret project?" she asked, kissing his cheek. "Maybe," he smiled mysteriously, "but this one's even bigger than the proposal." Sarah didn't push for details, but she noticed James had been making a lot of private phone calls and having meetings with doctors she didn't know. Whatever he was planning, she trusted it would be special. Their families, once so worried about their relationship, now worked together perfectly to help with the wedding. David and Richard, their fathers, spent weekends setting up the garden decorations. Rachel and Elizabeth turned the menu tasting into a friendly competition between soul food and traditional Cooper family recipes. Looking at everyone coming together, Sarah knew they had created something beautiful, not just a wedding, but a new kind of family that accepted and celebrated their differences. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. Botanical gardens looked magical, with white chairs arranged in a perfect circle under the old oak tree. Flowers in shades of purple and yellow lined the smooth pathway that led to the ceremony space. James's special white wheelchair waited at the front, decorated with small flowers that matched Sarah's bouquet. In the garden's bridal suite, Sarah sat quietly as her mother fixed her veil, the one made with James's grandmother's lace. Her white dress fit perfectly, flowing around her like a cloud. Lisa, her best friend from the hospital, carefully adjusted the train. "You look like an angel," Rachel said, tears in her eyes as she pinned the veil in place. "I was so wrong about James, baby. You two were meant to be together." Sarah smiled at her mother in the mirror. "Thank you, Mama. That means everything to me." Meanwhile, in another room, James was getting ready with his father and Sarah's father, David. His hands shook slightly as he tried to fix his bow tie. "Here, let me help you with that," David said, stepping forward. As he adjusted the tie, he looked James in the eye. "You know, when Sarah first told me about you, I was scared for her. But you've shown me what real love looks like. You're already like a son to me." James felt tears coming to his eyes but held them back. His white tuxedo jacket fit perfectly over his shirt, and his hair was neatly styled. The only sign of his nervousness was the way he kept checking his phone, where he had several unread messages from his doctors. The garden filled with guests, Sarah's large extended family, James' relatives, their hospital friends, and even some followers of their viral proposal story who had become close friends. Everyone noticed how the setup was perfect for James to move around easily in his wheelchair. At exactly noon, the music started. James took his place at the front, his white wheelchair gleaming in the sunlight. His heart nearly stopped when he saw Sarah appear at the end of the path. She looked stunning in her white dress, holding a bouquet of yellow daisies, the same flowers from their proposal night. Sarah's father walked her down the aisle, both of them taking slow, measured steps on the smooth path. When they reached James, David kissed his daughter's cheek and placed her hand in James's. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. They had written their own vows, speaking from their hearts about how their love had overcome every obstacle. When Sarah talked about how James's strength had inspired her, there wasn't a dry eye in the garden. "I promise to love you without limits," James said, his voice strong and clear. "You saw past my wheelchair and into my heart. You've given me a love I never thought I would find." Sarah's voice shook with emotion as she said her vows. "I promise to choose you every day, just as you choose me. You've shown me that love knows no boundaries, and together we can overcome anything." After they exchanged rings, it was time for the jumping the broom ceremony. James's parents held one end of the beautifully decorated broom, while Sarah's parents held the other, symbolizing the joining of their families. Sarah carefully pushed James's wheelchair over the broom as everyone cheered. The garden erupted in applause as they were pronounced husband and wife. Sarah leaned down to kiss James, and at that moment, a butterfly landed on her veil, something everyone saw as a sign of blessing. As they moved down the aisle together, guests threw white rose petals. Both sets of parents stood together, arms around each other, watching their children begin their new life. Even the garden staff wiped away tears at the beautiful sight. But what no one knew, except James and his doctors, was that the biggest surprise of the day was yet to come. As they headed to the reception area, James felt nervous excitement building in his chest. Soon, he would give Sarah and everyone else the shock of their lives. "Ready for the reception?" Sarah asked, squeezing his hand. James smiled mysteriously. "More than ready. This is going to be a celebration no one will ever forget." The wedding reception was in full swing at the garden's glass wall pavilion. Fairy lights twinkled overhead, and centerpieces of yellow daisies decorated every table. Sarah and James sat at the head table, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. Sarah noticed that James seemed nervous, checking his phone more often than usual. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly, touching his hand. "Perfect," he smiled. "Just waiting for the right moment." After dinner, it was time for speeches. Sarah's father spoke about how James had proved him wrong about love knowing no boundaries. James' mother talked about how Sarah had brought new life to their family. Even Lisa shared funny stories about how obviously in love they were at the hospital. Finally, it was James's turn to speak. He wheeled himself to the center of the dance floor, where everyone could see him. Sarah noticed several men in dark suits quietly entering the room, but she thought they must be late guests. First, James began, his voice clear and strong. "I want to thank everyone for being here today. Sarah and I have been blessed with amazing families who learn to look past their differences and become one family." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "But today, I have a special surprise. For the past year, while we were planning our wedding, I've been part of a secret medical trial." A murmur went through the crowd. Sarah sat up straighter, her heart beginning to race. "The doctors who just came in," James continued, gesturing to the men in suits, "have been working with me on an experimental treatment. Sarah, my love, you've always said you love me exactly as I am. But I wanted to give you something special on our wedding day." The men in suits stepped forward. One was carrying what looked like a folded metal frame. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as she realized what it was: an advanced medical exoskeleton. "With this new technology," James explained, his voice shaking slightly, "and after months of secret therapy sessions, I can do something I never thought possible again." The doctors helped James attach the sleek exoskeleton to his legs. The room was completely silent, everyone holding their breath. Sarah stood up, tears already running down her face. Slowly, carefully, James pushed himself up from his wheelchair. The exoskeleton whirred softly as it supported his movements. For the first time in years, James was standing on his own 2 feet. Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She just watched as her husband, who she had only ever known in a wheelchair, took one shaky step forward, then another, and another. "Oh my God," she whispered as James slowly walked toward her. Behind her, she could hear her mother crying and people gasping in amazement. James stopped in front of her, standing tall and proud. "Sarah Washington Cooper," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you do me the honor of having our first dance?" The band began to play their song, "At Last" by Etta James. Sarah stepped into her husband's arms, careful not to disturb his balance. Together, they began to sway gently to the music. "How?" she asked through her tears. "When did you?" "All those extra therapy sessions and doctor's appointments," he explained softly. "I wanted to surprise you. The exoskeleton is still experimental, and I'll mostly use my wheelchair, but for special moments like this." Sarah couldn't finish her sentence. She just held him closer as they moved together on the dance floor. Around them, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Both sets of parents held each other, watching their children share this miraculous moment. James's doctors stood nearby, ready to help if needed, but James was steady on his feet. All those months of secret practice had paid off. As they danced, he told Sarah about the trial, the hours of therapy, the falls and frustrations, all hidden so he could give her this perfect moment. You didn't have to do this, Sarah whispered. I love you just as you are. I know. James smiled, spinning her slowly. That's exactly why I wanted to do it. Your love gave me the strength to try the impossible. As the song ended, the room erupted in applause and cheers. But Sarah and James barely noticed. They were lost in their own world, this magical moment where love had truly conquered all boundaries. 1 year after their magical wedding, Sarah and James sat in their new home, looking through their wedding photos. The pictures of their first dance, with James standing tall in his exoskeleton, had spread across the internet even faster than their proposal video. Their story had touched millions of hearts around the world. Look at this one, Sarah said, pointing to a photo where James was taking his first steps toward her. I still can't believe you kept that secret for so long. James smiled, sitting comfortably in his regular wheelchair. While he still used the exoskeleton for special occasions, his wheelchair remained his daily choice. The hardest part was not telling you during all those therapy sessions, he admitted, but seeing your face that day made it all worth it. Their life together had become more than just a love story. They had started a foundation called Love Without Limits that helped other couples facing similar challenges. The foundation provided support for interracial couples, couples dealing with disabilities, and families learning to accept relationships that were different from what they expected. Sarah's dream of opening a medical clinic had also come true. With help from James's technical skills and their combined savings, they opened a fully accessible clinic in her old neighborhood. James designed special computer systems that made it easier for patients with disabilities to check in and communicate with doctors. Remember how worried our parents were about us? Sarah asked, turning to another page in the album. There was a photo of both sets of parents at the clinic's opening, standing proudly together like old friends. Now they can't get enough of each other, James laughed. It was true, their parents had weekly dinner parties together, went on couples' vacations, and were even planning to start a small business together, combining the Cooper's restaurant experience with Rachel Washington's baking skills. The biggest surprise came when Sarah and James announced they were expecting a baby. Both families were overjoyed. James immediately started working on making their home even more accessible, designing a nursery that would let him easily care for their child from his wheelchair. How's the little one today? James asked, placing his hand on Sarah's growing belly. Active, just like their daddy, Sarah smiled. The doctor says everything looks perfect. They had decided not to find out the baby's gender, wanting one more surprise in their life of amazing surprises. James's parents had already bought every baby item in their expensive boutiques, while Sarah's mother was busy knitting blankets and baby clothes. Their story had also brought unexpected changes to the hospital where they first met. Sarah still worked there part-time, and the hospital had used their story to create better policies for patients with disabilities. They even invited James to speak at medical conferences about improving hospital accessibility. The exoskeleton technology that James had helped test was now helping other people with spinal cord injuries. He worked closely with the medical team, using his software skills to make the technology better and easier to use. Sometimes, he visited rehabilitation centers to show other patients what was possible. You know what's funny? Sarah said, closing the photo album. Everyone thought our differences would make life harder, but they'd only made it richer. James nodded, taking her hand. We've shown them that love doesn't see barriers, it sees possibilities. That evening, they hosted a small dinner party. Both sets of parents came over, along with Lisa and some friends from the hospital. As they sat around the table, sharing food and laughter, Sarah looked at their mixed family with joy in her heart. James caught her eye and smiled, knowing exactly what she was thinking. Their love story hadn't ended at their wedding, it was just beginning. Every day brought new challenges and victories, but they faced them together. Later that night, as they sat on their back porch watching the stars, Sarah rested her head on James's shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. For what? He asked. For showing me that true love has no limits, she said, for being exactly who you are. James squeezed her hand, feeling their baby kick. Their story had become more than just about a black woman marrying a disabled man. It was about breaking down barriers, changing minds, and showing the world that love could overcome any obstacle when two hearts beat as one.